Great. Thank you very much, and greetings to all my fellow 21st century revolutionaries. Today, I want to talk about the idea of economic democracy. We all expect political democracy, so why not economic democracy as well? Um, this is a really unfinished element of the democratic revolutions that began 400 years ago in Britain against the monarchy, the Chartists, the suffragettes, and so on. It's a continuation of that democratic struggle, but in the economic realm. And the basic problem is that although we have one person, one vote in the political system, in the economic system, the managers, the major shareholders, the directors, they have all the votes, and working people are excluded. So all economic decision making revolves around the tyranny of a managerial shareholding class who dictate the economy, dictate individual enterprises, and dictate the overall trajectory of our economy. Now, I just don't think that's compatible with democracy. I think there needs to be a system whereby ordinary people, whether they're working in public institutions like the NHS or in private enterprises like BP, bad, that the employees have a say, that they have a right to have a voice and indeed power in that institution. I go back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, the then quite right-wing Labour government of James Callaghan commissioned Lord Bullock to write a report on industrial democracy. And he came up with the idea that all enterprises with 50 or more employees should be required by law to have 50% worker representation on the management boards of companies, and for there to be a mutually agreeable chair, mutually decided between management, directors, shareholders, and workers. That would have been an absolute revolution in terms of shifting the balance of power from capital to labor. But in my opinion, the biggest ever mistake the trade union movement has made in its history was to vote that down. It said this was corporatism. It said this was co-option into the system. Well, just imagine how much power workers would have today under that setup compared to what they have today. I'm not saying Lord Bullock's proposals were perfect or the ideal, but they would have massively strengthened the power of ordinary working people and their unions to have a say in their enterprises, the say in wages and conditions, in health and safety, environmental impact, all those kind of issues. And that would have been a really powerful check and balance against big capital. So that's one idea that I think is worth revisiting. I would probably slightly tweak it. I'd probably say that maybe there should be a tripartite system whereby managers, directors, shareholders have 1/3 of the seats on the management decision-making board, 1/3 for employees, and 1/3 to represent consumers. Precisely how this would work out, well, that's detail, but that would give both employees and consumers a direct input into the way in which enterprises run. And as I want to emphasize, not just private enterprises like pharmaceuticals or whatever, but also public institutions like local municipal councils, the National Health Service, publicly run utilities. All these should have employee and consumer input. Nationalization as a model in Britain has always been a form of basically state capitalism because the publicly owned enterprises, as they were still run on basically the same kind of managerial lines as the old private owners. So nationalization did not in any way change control. It changed ownership, but not control. And in fact, control is what is absolutely paramount. The left has traditionally been hung up about ownership, but it's control that's really important because in the nationalized industries like the old coal board or the British Railways and so on, they were run like private enterprises. The workers, the employees had no say. They were shut out of economic power. And that to me was a failed model of state ownership, but discontinued disenfranchisement of workers and indeed consumers. So that's one idea. Another idea would be to look at the cooperative models, which in Spain, Mogradin, cooperative models, whereby industries or enterprises become cooperatives rather than private ownership. That's another model, another way of democratizing the economy. It would mean that enterprises would be owned cooperatively by the employees who work there. Now, of course, there have been lots of attempts to set up cooperatives, but usually with failed industries. So there were in the 70s and 70s in the 1970s, there were several attempts to set up workers' cooperatives for failing enterprises, but they didn't work because they were failing. And by the time they became cooperatives, they weren't viable. But the Spanish example, it does show how cooperatives set up not in crisis mode, not in an emergency to save an industry, but well-founded, established cooperatives. That's an alternative, different model of economic ownership and control. Because of course, in the cooperatives, the employees who are part of the cooperative, they decide and they have the decision-making power over how that enterprise operates. Another model would be like the Swedish Meissner plan, which would be to give workers over time ownership and share through shareholding. That under the Meissner plan, workers in Swedish enterprises were to receive shares in their enterprise. An alternative model was to base it on increases in productivity. But the idea was that over time, the workers would have a majority of shares. And so those shares, they would effectively pass into a majority ownership by employees, and that would give them effective control and indeed ownership of the enterprises in which they worked. That model was used for a while in Sweden, but it was never properly implemented and basically was eventually withdrawn. But I think the principle is right. We can disagree about the details and we can have different ideas about precisely how it works. But I think the principle, particularly when it comes to increases in productivity, if workers are increasing productivity, they should share in that. And one way to share in that increase in productivity would be to give them shares. And one of the ideas was that these shares should not be given to the individual in the work in the enterprise, but be given to what they call the workers' share fund, where all the workers, all the employees in enterprise held their shares collectively and administered them collectively for the benefit of all the workforce. And indeed, under this plan, often decisions were made to take into account environmental and social impacts. So, change the company's policy to be more environmentally aware and protective. So these are just a couple of ideas that I think are worth thinking about. I'm sure there are better, more astute minds than mine who can make them sound even better and work it out even more detail. But I think this basic principle of democratizing the economy, it's something that's long, long, long overdue. And we need to, in my view, make the economic system operate more in parallel and on a similar basis to the political system where it's one person, one vote. So I think I'll finish there so we can open up for questions and contributions or criticisms if you don't agree.
Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate that giving a coverage for us. So just inviting people who are attending, if you've got a question, then either put it into the Q&A or put it into the chat. I'll be looking at both. And please let me know when you're asking a question whether you would like to ask it yourself or whether you want me to read it out. So just put please read or I'll ask along with your question. Um, I've heard it said that we've been winning in so many ways over the decades and the centuries. Um, Gaining, the women's right and gaining rights for gay marriage and gaining civil rights and all of these wins that we've had, and yet the big one that we've not succeeded on is the economic, and that we've been losing quite considerably there. Um, is your sense that this can be turned around?
I think, with every radical idea, there's a way of presenting it. And I think for the average person, when you put it this way, that Britain is an economic dictatorship
Mhm.
that is not run democratically when it concerns the economy, most people sort of will find that a surprising statement, but when they pause and think about it, will tend to agree. And um, so I think it's always about, making the arguments and doing it in a way that's popular and accessible. I mean, one thing that's very obvious is there are billions, hundreds of billions of pounds in pension funds, and these are privately administered by people who have, have the capitalist mindset. They're investing them based on, very orthodox economic indicators and indices. So one other proposal for economic democracy would be to give trade unions or employee mutual societies direct control of their own pension funds. Because at the moment they pay into a pension fund, it's ministered by a boss in the city, and they've got no say how it's used. It could be used for arms manufacturing, for fossil fuel companies. Um, that they could be using it in all kinds of ways, sweatshop labor in developing countries. If the employees had control of their own pension funds through employee mutual societies or trade union controlled mutual societies, um, that would give them an input and they could make conscious decisions about how that money is invested. And they can be mindful that maybe instead of chasing maximum profits, you know, somewhere else in the world, maybe it's better to invest it in their own local community. So in the northeast of England and other deprived parts of the UK, people's pension funds are going to the City of London and they're investing it on the markets all over the world. They're just after, mostly after the fastest, quickest profit. Whereas if that money could be invested in local communities in the Northeast, the actual profit margin might be a little bit less, but it would be creating jobs and improving living standards for ordinary people in that area.
Yeah, thank you. Good to bring up the pension funds. One of my first campaigns that I got involved with was fossil fuel divestment, and we were targeting pension funds at the time, which are these just enormous things with very little oversight. Um,
I think the amount in pension funds today is over £1 trillion, I think.
yeah, I would believe it.
Well over a trillion,
Yeah.
And if you could have that money under the control of employee mutual societies or trade union funds, and you could have a sort of sense of a social conscience, then those funds could be invested much more beneficially for local communities.
I've got another few questions for you, but just to call on the other attendees here. So bring your questions. I know around sort of money and economics, it can sometimes be a bit of a freeze and like, it's all complex. But just to say there's no stupid questions. All of the questions are viable. So if you have a question, please bring it. Um, you mentioned some. I love the ideas of splitting control into not only the owners but also the consumers and the workers. Fabulous idea. Is there are there campaigns that are working to advance that? Or where are we in that? Is that yeah.
We're almost where the Chartists were in the early 18th century, or the precursors of the Chartists. Um, it's a very small group of people who are interested in these ideas, and I've been championing them for like 50 years. Um, and I have spoken at trade union conferences and got huge, enthusiasm, but then nothing ever happens.
Mm.
And for me, of course, trade unions should be concerned with basic things like wages and conditions, but they also should have a bigger vision about empowering working people. How can we empower working people to give them a real meaningful say in the enterprises, public and private, where they work? That ought to be, to me, a major focus of trade union concern. But it's sort of like I do these talks and all this fantastic, brilliant, we're really enthusiastic, and then I say, well, put a motion to the trade union congress, and it never seemed. Well, I think once or twice it has happened, but it got very low on the list and didn't get properly debated. I think the Green Party has talked a bit about these ideas, but not in much detail.
Right. And I wonder what that freeze is that we collectively have around this. Because, as you say, as soon as you say we're in an economic dictatorship, it's clear, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, I want liberation. I want out of this. And, with the cost of living crisis and the crunch and everything is penny pinched and it's difficult just to get by these days. Um, why have we not why are Occupy came out as a movement, but that was 15 years ago now.
Yeah.
Uh, where are the movements for economic change?
Yeah, I mean, in the 1970s and 80s, Arthur Scargill, the former leader of the Mine Workers Union, Tony Benn, the left-wing Labour MP, and others did talk about ideas of industrial democracy, but it was more a concept rather than practicalities. The one thing they did focus on was workers' cooperatives. And indeed, Tony Benn, when he was a minister, um, did actually help fund a workers' cooperative, but it was in when it was in crisis and when it really wasn't really viable anymore. Um, so yeah, there has been this history, but it's sort of gone by the wayside, and that is I find it very strange and very odd, and I wish I knew how to revive it. And I thought that by doing these talks, trade union and other similar events, that I'd help popularize it and others could take up the baton. But we haven't, it just hasn't happened.
I suspect it's still to come. We got a hand up from Jan, so I'm going to allow you to talk. You should be able to
Thanks
unmute.
very much. Sorry about that. I'm a bit yeah. So basically, um um yeah, the I've just recently joined the Green Party and I've joined your party. I also was a data investigative journalism doing research into local government pension schemes, which you
Mhm.
didn't mention, Peter, but they are in fact quite lucrative, and they are for nurses, policemen, firefighters. Anyone in the public sector has a
Yeah.
public sector pension. All these pensions amount to 100 separate pensions up and down the country and bring in about 2.3, 2.4 billion per year.
Mhm.
Our investigations uncovered untold corruption within these pension funds, i.e., people investing in fracking companies at the same time they were deciding planning permission for said fracking companies. So I
Mhm.
totally agree with you on that one and giving it to trade unions, although I don't really think trade unions are the answer here. I think trade unions are often hand in glove with governments. However, um, yeah, so recently I've joined the Greens, I've joined your party. I've never been in a political party in my life. I'm a pragmatic anarchist. And yeah, I mean, I kind of fully support what you do, Peter. Maybe you could sit and arrest Donald Trump or something like that.
If only I could. If only I could. And I would I would if I could get near him, but he like Benjamin Netanyahu is like encircled by such security you can't get near them. Yeah, I just add, I think the option is either trade union controlled funds, pension funds, or share funds, or employee mutual societies where all the employees in a particular workplace or particular company would form a mutual society and they would collectively administer it for their benefit and the benefit of their community.
Got a question coming from Jan, who's requested that I read it out. The question says, I think it's almost as taboo as being a Republican in the UK, to present these ideas of economic democracy. How could we transfer this into everyday conversation? I think it's almost shocking to people. Could we use children's books? It feels almost like it's a fairy tale to have economic democracy.
Yeah, well, certainly it's like all new ideas or ideas that aren't in the part of the consensus. They take, courage and determination to push them forward. And that means, people, doing campaigning. I mean, um, I had at various points discussed with various mostly left-wing Labour MPs and trade union people about setting up a campaign for economic democracy, which is the obvious thing to do. But just for some reason, it just never happened, and maybe I need to restart the idea now, and obviously not just me, but with lots of others, because I'm sure there are people out there who have similar ideas or open to this idea. But we certainly need a campaign, and we need to have prominent people from public life and ordinary people together, working together to popularize it and to make it, if you like, the common sense approach. It is common sense to say if you expect political democracy, you should also expect economic democracy.
Got another question coming in. Thank you again, Peter. Question from Basil this time. I'll just read it because you weren't clear on whether you wanted me to read it or not. Says the US Constitution and people's lawsuits over 300 years prioritize commerce and corporations. So we have no rights and laws are superseded. Maybe that's the Magna Carta too. I hear your economic moves can be valuable and they add up. We've often got worse laws in many of the 50 states' constitutions placed in them by evil racist deniers, is the question.
I don't think it's a question, it's just a statement
It's a
which I tend
statement.
to concur with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to riff off that? Riff off.
Well, again, the United States is founded on the principles of democracy. The actual reality, of course, often falls far short, but the principle and ethos of democracy is ingrained in US culture and constitution. I mean, I think the great thing about economic democracy is everybody, apart from far right extremists, supports democracy. So it's an idea that's cutting with the grain of public consciousness. You know, lots of traditional left-wing ideas go against popular consciousness. Not that they're bad ideas, but just they go against the grain. Whereas this one, economic democracy, it goes with the grain where there is a public consensus that democracy is a good thing. And that's why that's its great strength.
Yeah. I've got a question here about have you written a book on this, and is there one? Um, it's
The answer is
inspiring.
no. No, I haven't written a book on it. I've written lots of articles over the years, but not a book. Um, I'm very bad at writing books these days. The last book I wrote was over 20 years ago, and I'm so busy with my human rights work, it's very difficult to find the time to write books. Um, but yeah, I agree that getting someone to write a book about this issue would be a very important way to popularize it. I'm surprised that a lot of the left-wing theorists and writers have not done so. Yanis Vera, can't pronounce his name, Yanis Varoufakis. Is obviously one that brings to mind. Thomas Piketty. I don't think any of them have engaged with the idea of economic democracy. Maybe in passing, but nothing sort of along the lines that I'm proposing. So yeah, someone needs to do it. Absolutely.
I got a question around a sense that we're coming close to another bust cycle, that some massive economic crash is likely to happen, various bubbles um, in the markets. What's likely to be sort of the effect of that given the current laws? Are we going to see mass repossessions across the UK and around the world, or yeah, what's your sense of when the crash comes, where's the pain going to be and where's the resistance going to come from?
Well, you're right. All the economic experts, with any clarity and sincerity, are predicting that we're in a huge, huge, basically casino economy where things are likely to go bust, and that a big bust is on its way. I think it's probably going to be of the order of the 2008 financial crash. And of course, some people lost their savings. Some people ended up, well, I'm talking about not, we have financial protection here in the UK up to £85,000 now, but in many countries, people lost their savings. Um, they defaulted on their homes. Their homes were repossessed. So that's a very, very scary prospect. Um, and in terms of resisting it, um, well, the only way we can resist is to ensure tougher financial regulation so that companies don't have the legal power to play fast and loose with the economy, with people's savings and pensions. That's the only thing. And as you know, there's been some degree of deregulation uh, since the regulations were tightened way back in the wake of 2008's financial crash. So that's scary here in Britain that the financial controls are not as tight as they were back then. And indeed, the Labour government is actually talking about liberalising regulations precisely at the moment when the danger of a new crash is very real. That strikes me as incredibly short-sighted, foolish, and it's gambling with people's savings, homes, and livelihood.
And I'm just noticing a language around it of people lost their savings and homes were repossessed. And but I want to say something like these were stolen, that these economic crashes is
Hmm.
this gambling industry that we call the finance industry. And they
Mm.
know that they're going to do this and they steal people's homes and they steal people's savings in this. And to really think about these, shift it and think differently around these, um, because repossessed is such a gentle term for
Yeah,
the theft that's happening.
absolutely. And of course, the millionaires and billionaires, they did take a hit for a while, but now they're bigger than ever. So in terms of the long term, the very, very, very rich, who have a big responsibility for that crash, they ultimately came back with even greater wealth than ever.
Yeah.
And it is so shocking that um, we have a financial conduct authority, you know, financial negligence and recklessness. is a criminal offence. But in 2008, nobody was prosecuted. None of the like the Northern Rock were not prosecuted, despite the fact they were paying, they were taking incredible risks, which ended up in that financial institution collapsing and having to be taken into public ownership. Um, so it's always the case the public, through the government, bails out big business when there's a crash, but we don't get the benefits. So all those banks like RBS and Northern Rock that were taken into public ownership and saved, and people's savings were protected for the most part. Um, when they resold the stock, well, some of it was sold at knockdown prices, and some of it a bit later, but not at the optimum moment when we could have made a handy surplus for the exchequer to fund public services.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm torn because I've got loads of questions bubbling up, but I've got questions from attendees. So I'll read this one from Fiona, who says, in the light of the AI threat to jobs, isn't it time for a universal basic income? And I reached over to grab this book, Inventing the Future, which also talks about demanding this universal basic income. It's a good book if people have not read it. Highly recommend it. But Peter, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been a long time supporter of a universal basic income because people have a right to fundamental security, and the universal basic income seeks to do that. So young people starting out in life, um, they have, a guaranteed um, seed money for their future, whether that be education or jobs and training. Um, the universal basic income, it is a way of ensuring that there is a safety net, a real safety net, and avoiding, in many instances, it would avoid people having to go and claim benefits. And that the benefit system is a huge bureaucracy which costs billions to run, let alone the cost of actually the benefits. It's a short-sighted, cumbersome way of solving a basic problem, which is that everyone should have a basic livable income so they can have a decent, healthy life.
Hmm. There's a question around rent, that we are in the phase where people are struggling so much to pay their rents, and there's been no real teeth around rent controls in this country, and so it's just gone up and up and up, squeezing people more and more. And yet it's this really basic thing: we need shelter in order to do all the other functions of life. Um, what can we do? What's coming around this? Because it's reaching a point where people obviously just can't keep paying more and more and more, and
Mm.
so much of this is now paying these massive hedge funds who own huge amounts of property in the
Yeah,
center of cities.
yeah.
Um, what's a possible way out of this?
Well, if capitalist New York can have rent controls, I don't see why London can't. I mean, I know there aren't rent controls everywhere, but in lot, for many people in living in New York do live in rent controlled apartments, and they've done so. It's existed for many, many years. So if capitalist New York can do it, why can't London? Absolutely. It is unconscionable that people having such a struggle to keep up with these rent increases, which, you know, some rent increases may be justified, but usually it's just the landlord is hiking up the rent to make the maximum profit. And housing, a basic fundamental human right like housing, should not be for profit. But at the end of the day, of course, what we also have to do is build more affordable housing, both to buy and to rent, so that ordinary people have a chance to have a decent place, a roof over their heads. And the government has cracked down on rogue landlords with the new laws that just come in, to ban no-fault evictions, which was an absolute scandal that it was ever allowed.
Mhm.
Um, but much more needs to be done to, clamp down on rogue landlords who let properties with mold and damp and, you know, inadequate, safety precautions. I mean, by law, they're supposed to have them, but the policing of properties, particularly properties in multiple occupation, is very patchy and very poor. So landlords will get away with, perhaps not having like a carbon dioxide alarm. They're supposed to have it, but some don't. And
Yeah.
the policing system is very weak.
And my own experience around all of this is that we're living in a time where we've got so much burden and pressure on us that our imagination for what's possible is squashed.
Mm,
And in Jem Bendel's book Breaking Together, he talks about liberation from the finance industry, liberation from um, sort of this crushing weight that we've all got. And so as these systems break down, um, and maybe it becomes less possible for the sort of parasitical finance industry to take so much from us. Um, I guess I'm just like expecting that something will lift off us at some point, and it will probably be through an awful lot of hard work and civil disobedience and campaigning that
mm.
that lift comes. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure I've got a question here. I'm just like,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. To get some form of economic democracy, whether it be the full whack or just part way there, any element of economic democracy is progress compared where we are today. But in terms of all these other issues as well, rent controls and so on, you know, it's the old adage, you have to campaign. And, we need, there's a great renters campaign, um, which has basically pressured and forced the Labour government to introduce this ban on no-fault evictions. But much more effort is required across the board. You don't get if you don't organize and campaign. That's the lesson of history.
thanks, Peter. I've got a question from coming in from Annie. What statistics or narrative do you find most useful to have persuasive conversations around this, around economic democracy?
I think when you tell people, remind people that they're contributing to a pension fund, but they have no say and no control over it. Um, the first instinct will say, "Oh, I'd rather leave it to the experts." But fair enough. You can have experts who are more attuned to your values. So the current administrators of pension funds are basically hacks working for the City of London. You know, there are green and ethical finance experts who could be employed by employee mutual societies or trade union trade union controlled pension funds, and they would operate according to a framework or set of values set up by the employees or the trade union members. So they would have ethical green investments as one criterion. Um, you know, looking at how the money could be perhaps if it's in a rough deprived part of the UK, how that money could be better invested in those deprived communities rather than in Singapore or South Korea or wherever. So I think, that's broadly the way to go. And when you explain this to people, I find that most people sort of get it. They still think it's a bit edgy and a bit sort of, um, you know, a bit off the consensus, and they struggle with it a bit, but they get the basic idea that if employees have these billions in pension funds, then employees should have a right to have some say and some control how they're used. And a lot of employees, in deprived parts of the country would probably say, well, getting the maximum profit for the pension fund is an ideal, but if we can perhaps take a, a slightly less um, rate of profit, but invest it to build affordable houses in this community, to create sports and leisure facilities for local people, whatever, then most people, I think, are open to that. Um, the other thing, that the other argument, which is the one I started on, was most people get when you say Britain is an economic dictatorship, the managers, the shareholders, the directors, they have all the power, workers have none. Most people get that, and they get a sense that that's unfair. But the question is then, often they struggle to see how could there be an alternative. And so when you talk about workers' cooperatives, um, and again with workers' cooperatives, it's not that every worker will have responsibility for making all the decisions, but they will set out the parameters for these decisions for the company. And of course, they can, in most workers' cooperatives, employees can call for a vote on X, Y, and Z policy, but often they will just simply appoint a a financial board who will run it for them, but within the framework of their values, their priorities, their policies. And again, most people get that, and um, yeah, so I just think the one person, one vote in the political system, but not in the economic system, that also grabs people's attention.
Mm, yeah, definitely. I guess an important part of it. I got a question that's coming in about, so it's bringing up the author Jason Hickel, who talks about how democratic planning of our economies is essential to regain control over productive capacities. Um, have you read Jason's work? Are you aware of this sort of concept? And is there anything to say?
Yeah, a little bit, but it is basically a rehash of the left-wing Labour policy, particularly espoused by Tony Benn, late Tony Benn MP, for planning agreements. So his proposal was that industry would operate according to planning agreements with the government. The government would set out a series of um, social, ethical parameters, and um, the planning agreements would be conducted with industries, some of them funded by a national investment fund. So Tony Benn had these ideas about similar to the wealth funds that exist in Scandinavian countries, a national investment fund or investment bank that would fund particular new industries or rebuild and refashion older industries. Um, and this would be organized through planning agreements with industry. So you'd have planning agreements with all, the car making sector, food sector, and so on. There'd be planning agreements about what their targets were and how they would achieve them, and as part of that, there would be uh, agreements about wages and conditions and so on. So yeah, I think that democratic planning of the economy um, is is also part of the equation, but it's more at the macro level, um, so that's something governments could do. But what my ideas are more concerned with is the micro level, sort of in individual institutions, as I said, like local councils or the National Health Service, or publicly owned utilities, but also private enterprise as well. That the employees in those institutions would have direct influence, power, and votes.
Yeah. We've got about 5 minutes left. So if you've got any more questions, then now is the time to ask them, even if it's the one that has been teetering on the edge of asking. Please bring it. By all of this, I'm reminded of about 5 years ago, I was part of XR's Blood Money March, and a couple of days before, I'd been asked, "Can you go down and be one of the people to take action and spray the London Guildhall?" I didn't know much about the Guildhall, but I trusted the organisers, so I said yes. Went down and sprayed it, and then I had a about 3 year court process around that. Um, Ended up paying. Well, actually, someone else paid the fine for me, and I had to work in the RSPCA charity shop for a few months. Um, but in that process, I did a lot of digging around, like, so what is this Guildhall, and why was I spraying it? I'd done a little bit of research beforehand, but I did a lot more afterwards to discover sort of this is an institution that goes back to Roman times and has been there, sort of framing, shaping, molding the economic elitism of this country in the UK for 2,000 years, and how much it's outside of the laws. It literally is outside of the laws of the United Kingdom. The City of London is an entity in its own right that can supersede the laws of the United Kingdom. And I was just shocked to see like how deep this economic tyranny and dictatorship goes. Um, and I remember somebody saying that if you wanted to be rich in this country, then make sure that your ancestor was friends with William the Conqueror, who, of course, was basically came over with as a military caste and came and stole this land and
Mm.
gave it to his mates.
Mm.
Uh, and I've seen your sign there, 10% wealth tax on 171 UK billionaires raises 60 billion. And I'm guessing most of those have got ancestors that were in that military caste that stole this country. And it just seems an extraordinary statistic. And I also looked at your video from 6 months ago, and the same sign is there. And, you've had that up. And it seems like such an important thing of like, that's all it would take. They're talking about how do they raise income for the
Mm.
income tax or not for the thing, and they're tripping over themselves to find 2 billion here and 3 billion there. Um, 60 billion just available if only we could take the courage
Mm.
um, to actually tax the people who have got far too much um, and are only counting scores basically
Mm.
between themselves.
Of course, the critics say that if we had a wealth tax, the rich would leave and they'd take their assets with them, but most of their assets are not movable.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in Scandinavian countries where there's been a wealth tax, only a very small proportion have actually left. And then I think, again, talking about making ideas popular, we have to call out those people. If they're not willing to pay a fair share of tax, then they are economic traitors.
Hmm.
They're putting their own greed before the wealth and prosperity of the country. They're not true patriots. And I don't like using the language of patriotism, but I think in this particular case, it's quite effective. And when I've used it, it's quite effective and justified. Um, because, you know, you know, ordinary working people, they give their lives and, do their jobs, contribute to the wealth and productivity of the country, contribute public services and, lots of good things. But very rich seem to think that, they can, they've got no true loyalty to the country. And that's really shameful. And I think there should be a shame campaign against the very rich who object to a wealth tax, because they're basically, as I said, they are greedy bastards who are putting their own self-interest before that of the country, and they can afford it. A 10% is quite a whack, but even then, for the multimillionaires and billionaires, 10% is peanuts. They might have to sell one of their fine artworks or a couple of luxury cars or a plane or something, but they can afford it. They can
Yeah.
afford it. And it's shocking to think that they are resisting. Although I'm sure you've heard of patriotic millionaires, which is a group of millionaires who do believe they should be paying more tax. A variation on the system on my wall is, which the Green Party and others are espousing, is a 2% wealth tax on assets over 10 million pounds. That would raise 24 billion. So the first 10 million in assets would not be taxed.
Hmm.
other than any existing tax liabilities. But the wealth tax would kick in after for in excess of 10 million. And that raises 24 billion. That's Rachel Reeves' problem solved overnight.
Yeah.
And these people are 2%. I mean, if you got 500 million, 2%, okay, it's a fair whack, but it's nothing, isn't it? You're not going to be wandering around in sackcloth and ashes. You're not going to be having a begging bowl on the street. Um, yeah, maybe you have to sell one of your 5 or 6 houses around the world. Yeah,
And give up some of the control and allow some of us to just have the little bit more ease in our life. And of
yeah,
course, clinging on to this wealth is it's literally killing people, and
yeah,
it's a sickness on the entire country.
yeah.
Um, Peter, I think we have to call it there. Thank you so much for your words and your presence today, and for the many decades of campaigning and bringing yourself into this work. It's really appreciated. Um,
Well, me and many others, me and many others. It's always a collective effort. So we all work together in different ways, and it's our collective strength that makes change happen.
For sure, it's all about the collective. So I'm going to just put into the chat a few things. If you would like to get involved with Revolution in the 21st Century, we have inductions coming up this week and next. So register at that event. The link there, rev21.earth/events. And if you'd like to support the work of Rev21, um, please do. Oh, thank you, Ariana, for putting the links in there. We could really use your support. There's already 500 revolutionaries donating, building real power. And it's through this that we can build the kind of campaigns and link the campaigns actually across Europe and the world, is what we're also working on. So please give your support if you can, financially or with your time. And then finally, there's the link there about joining civil resistance groups near you, so the A22 network is a network that links together many civil resistance groups. Um, so please get involved in whatever way you can. Thank you again, Peter. Really appreciate your presence, your time, your words, and your life.
All right.
And we'll end it
Thanks to
there.
you and to everybody. Thanks. We go forward. The only way is forward, onwards
Onwards.
and upwards.
Forward. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.